पहली दफा I am in Scotland.
I like your program. I've watched it over many years. You lived in the United Kingdom for so long, and it took you this long to come to Scotland.
Scotland's next leader has just been announced. Humza become Scotland's first minister.
In your speech when you become first minister, you mentioned that when your grandparents यहाँ आए, they never ever thought that one day their grandson can or might become first minister.
You know, it's one of the great sadnesses in my life that my grandparents, both maternal and paternal, were not around to see me become First Minister. But despite them not being physically present, I definitely feel their presence.
People also argue that one is like supporting minority and one is supporting LGBTQ.
For me, people will criticise, I think, when you're in that position, whatever you do. My point has been a very simple one. You cannot support only some minority rights.
If you talk about Gaza, what do you think the world is still not doing what they should be doing?
Actually, the real tragedy beyond that is that so many have been complicit, and that it's the first live-streamed genocide in the world. Well, I hope I can always say that that my intention was pure, my intention was clear, and that I was always focused on public service, to be a voice for those that were the most vulnerable, that were suffering injustice, be that in Glasgow or Gaza.
Do you think with empathy can you survive in politics?
I think the public are quite smart. I think the public can see through somebody who's simply got naked ambition. So if I give you an example of that, in my view, somebody like Boris Johnson, who just, I think, had nothing but naked ambition, wanted to be Prime Minister for the sake of Prime Minister.
Whenever you go in front of the God, and if the God will ask you, okay, Humza, I have given you a lot of power and authority, what have you done? What would be your answer? Welcome to the talhaahadpodcast UK chapter. In this episode, I sat down with Humza Yousaf, the former First Minister of Scotland and the first Muslim to hold that office. We talked about his family's migration to Pakistan, his journey to Scotland's highest political seat, and the events that led to him stepping down. We discussed his relationship with the key UK political figures, his rift with Elon Musk, his stance on LGBTQ, and his views on ongoing genocide in Gaza. A special thanks to One Homes for supporting this episode. They are the only developers in Pakistan who are building homes exclusively for the diaspora community. It's important work helping people to stay connected with their roots in a meaningful way. Humza, thank you so much for taking the time out. Pehli dafa I am in Scotland actually. I lived in UK for 6-7 years. I did my bachelor's and master's, but I think this part of the England somehow I missed, I think.
Well, a bit sharm ki baat hai that you lived in the United Kingdom for so long, and it took you this long to come to Scotland.
I know.
You're welcome.
No, but thank you so much for taking the time out. I know you're a busy man. But when I was planning this podcast tour, this is our first ever international trip. So you were the first person on the list and we got you finally. So thank you for taking the time out.
Most welcome.
So I want to start like a little bit from your background. In your speech when you become a first minister, you mentioned that when your grandparents यहाँ आए, they never ever thought that one day their grandson can or might become a first minister. So like when this happened, what was the reaction of your, especially parents and grandparents?
You know, it's one of the great sadnesses in my life that my grandparents, both maternal and paternal, were not around to see me become First Minister, or even many of them not around, I'm afraid, to see me become a member of this Parliament. But despite them not being physically present, I definitely feel their presence. And especially in momentous occasions, when you take your oath to become a member of this Parliament, when you do your half, when you feel that weight on your shoulder. And that's the same when you become a minister, and especially when you become First Minister. Because there's no way, none whatsoever, that I would have the privilege of being in these positions if they hadn't made the incredible sacrifices that they had made in order for my father and mother, and then of course subsequently me, to have a better life. And so every day I think about them in this building and thank them for the sacrifices that they made.
You mentioned about like there's a weight on your shoulder. What kind of a weight was that? And not still now?
Do you know, it's a weight of responsibility, and that responsibility comes from different avenues. So when you're First Minister, you have the weight of the entire nation because you are the representative of Scotland. What you say, how you act, how you're perceived on the global stage as well as the domestic stage. This is a big weight. You think about every syllable, every word, every sentence. But then there's also a really huge community weight. I'm somebody who's very proud to be Scottish Pakistani, very proud of my roots, very proud of my faith as well. And of course, the people who are from the Pakistani community and diaspora number in the millions. Those in the Muslim community number in the billions. And they look to you as a representative. They might not agree with all of your politics. They might not agree with all of your views, but you're seen as a son of the soil when it comes to Pakistan, or you're seen as one of the collective of the faith. And therefore, there's that huge responsibility in terms of the expectation from that community, let alone, as I say, from the entire nation that you're chosen to lead.
And what was going through in your head when you were taking the oath? Because I'm sure you were getting prepared, obviously, when you were, just consenting for the elections, like from that time. But when you get the news that, yes, you are becoming a first minister, like, what was the first sort of thought?
Well, I remember receiving the news. So we'd had a 6-week thereabouts campaign. And the 3 candidates were in a room, no bigger than this room that we're sat in. And the national secretary of the party came through. And she said, you're about to go out. There's hundreds of people from the world's media. And of course, many people from the party. And we're about to announce the result. And I'm here to tell you what the result is before you go out on stage. And she read out the tally. And we had 2 rounds of voting. But from the first round, it was very clear to me that I'd won, given the lead I had in the first round. And I remember just, again, feeling that weight immediately on my shoulders. And it was quite an emotional moment. And having to hold it together for that 2 minutes, knowing the result, and then it being announced when I went out into the room. And I tell you, thinking and looking at my father and mother who were in the front row, to me, it was an incredibly emotional moment.
And they didn't even know about it.
Nobody knew. My wife didn't know. They were all looking to see if I was smiling or was I frowning. But seeing my parents in the front row, again, thinking of their sacrifices, what they'd been through in life. And my father and mother both, from a young age, faced a lot of tragedy. My father lost his mother when he was only 15, coming to this country, new culture.
And this is 1906.
Yeah. He came here in the 1960s. My mother lost her eldest sister before they came to the UK, so in Pakistan, and the detrimental impact that had on her family. So they've both been through huge amounts of tragedy over the years, and for them to be able to enjoy a moment where their son becomes First Minister, let's not forget, in a country that is, predominantly over 90%, 95%, white, and of course, being a Muslim, you're a significant minority in this country, and to be chosen by your peers to then first be elected and then become First Minister, it was a matter of great pride.
And when you first met your father after that, what was his reaction, and what did he said? What was the first sort of words or lines?
Well, he said one of the first things he said was to tell me that his father, my grandfather, who came from Miachano in central Punjab in this 1960s, that my grandfather had a dream that I would one day meet the Queen. And my father never told me that dream before. Now, as it happens, I didn't meet the Queen, I met the King. But when it came to being I got inducted into what's called His Majesty's Privy Council. So when that happened, I then met the King, but also had an audience with His Majesty the King. And my father said to me, well, it looks like your Dadaji's dream was right after all. And the other thing that my parents said to me, my mother in particular, was to make sure that, we do two nafal of shukr, that we don't forget to thank God for the blessings that He's given. Because I'm, as I say, a person of deep faith. It was a responsibility I believe, also from God, to be in the position that I was in at that moment, at that time. So those were the things that my parents said, as well as, of course, being excited. I think my mother in particular, probably somewhat concerned, worried about what that would mean for the pressure that would come to bear upon me, the scrutiny, the public, the fact that your life becomes even more public in your family's life, the public intrusion that comes with that. Fair to say that she had a level of concern, maybe even Parshan as well, I think, about what was to come.
And you talk a lot about your faith, especially like if we go through your interviews, probably in like every interview, you mention this like so many times. Talk to me a little bit about when you were growing up, because there's a Scottishness, there's a Pakistan or like, that part as well. And then obviously the Muslim side. So what were the first sort of few years of your early childhood like?
I'm probably quite ashamed to say that when I was growing up, I didn't really embrace my Pakistani heritage. And in some respects, you can understand that because you're a minority. And when you're a child, you want to fit in with your peers. I was one of 2 Pakistani children in my primary school, only 2. Yeah. And so you want to fit in with your peers. And every Saturday, my mum would drag her children, myself included, to Urdu school. And of course, I'd always say to Mum, why? Why do I have to learn Urdu? This is why you and I are conducting this in English. She would say, because it's your language, it's your culture, it's your roots. And we would say, well, we're in Scotland, we speak English, we have no need to learn Urdu. And you actually shy away from your culture because you don't want to be seen to be different. And then I think it became evident to me post 9/11 that I almost felt betrayed, actually, by my peers and even by the country. Because here I had spent my youth doing my best to fit in, doing my best almost to assimilate, not just integrate, but assimilate. And then suddenly, the day after 9/11, I was being asked, why do Muslims hate America?
And what was your age?
16. Who flew those planes into the Twin Towers? Have you ever met the Taliban? These are questions that my peers are asking me. And I'm getting stopped and searched in my car. I'm getting stopped and searched by the police going through the railway stations, going through the airports. And I'll be in a group of 5 or 6 white friends, and I'll be the one who's pulled out and whose bag is searched. And to be honest, it felt like me, almost like my country had turned on me. And then as you get older, I think you begin to have an appreciation of your culture. And my faith has been lifelong, but your culture in particular, you begin to embrace that and you see it as a strength, not something to ever be ashamed of. And I'm very proud to be Scottish Pakistani. I don't see any conflict between the two. I love Scotland. It's my home. It's a country born and raised in, raising my family in, have the immense privilege to lead. And Pakistan is my where my ancestral roots are, a country that is held with deep affection in my heart.
And in your house, like what was happening again in terms of having a Pakistani parents? Were they like a pure Desi, or were they also embraced a little bit of Scottishness, or were they like sort of in the middle?
They were definitely, I would say, very proud of their roots, very proud. So I think really up to the age of 4 or 5, we only really spoke Punjabi in the house, a little bit of Urdu, but Zyada Punjabi and bolte the in the house. And then my mother actually is, although Pakistani, she came from East Africa, from Kenya, like many Pakistanis and indeed Indians did at the time. So I always thought her mentality was slightly different to my father's, who came directly from Pakistan. Perhaps he was slightly more traditional, but only slightly. There was not much in it. But they were always telling us to be very proud of our roots and where we came from and the struggles that our grandparents had made. And that's why they were so keen for us, despite our efforts to learn the language. So I was very pleased about that. They were never ones to shy away from culture. And they always told us, look, there's no conflict. You can be proud of being Scottish, be Scottish, football, play football, eat your fish and chips, do whatever you want, that's Scottish. But don't forget where your roots are. And don't be ashamed of your roots. And I'm very grateful to them for that upbringing.
And how was the first week for you as a first minister? Because you were in politics. It's again not something suddenly you got something. But what was the perception before that? And what was sort of the perception, not perception, the reality when you moved into that room? Okay, wow, now I need to run this country.
Yeah, I mean, it's really indescribable. It's a fantastic question because and I'll do my best to describe it, but it is actually, until you are in that moment, I suspect only the people who've held that office, the other former first ministers that are alive.
And you were also very young as well. Like, it was not like you had like years and years of experience.
No, 37, I think, when the result got announced. For me, it was, I keep using this phrase, but it was a huge weight when I walked into Butte House. That's the official residence of the First Minister. So when I walked into Butte House with my family for the first time, it was during Ramadan actually, and I was walking up the spiral staircase. And when you walk up the staircase is the pictures of all of the First Ministers previous. And I didn't realise that my picture would be up so quickly. But I got to Nicola Sturgeon, who was my predecessor, and then I saw my picture. And I remember my cousin who was with me that day saying to me, whatever happens next, nobody can take that away from you. You've made history. And this house will be here. It's already been here for hundreds of years. It will be here for another few hundred years, no doubt. And your picture will always be there. And it will be different because there's all white faces and then there's you and a young face and a Muslim face. And I remember at that moment, actually, I won't lie, at that moment, we shed a few tears because we were that emotional. But look, in politics, things move so quickly. I mean, I think if I'm correct in saying my result was announced about 2 p.m. That day. I think it was 2020, was it 28th of March, 2023, 2 p.m. By 3 p.m, 1 hour later, I was sitting with the most senior civil servant, the permanent secretary, going over what my legislative programme would look like. So you have an hour to absorb the result, and then you're straight into forming your cabinet, forming your government, and thinking about how you want to pursue the agenda that you wish to pursue.
And what are some of the big challenges? Let's say if you tell me, okay, Talha, like these are the 5 big challenges which I faced when you become a first minister. One, again, what was in your head and what was then the reality of, wow, like I haven't thought about this.
So I think what I underestimated was how much time your own internal party matters can consume. So anybody who's a political leader, you can, this is true in Pakistan, this is true in Scotland. I suspect it's true in any democratic society across the world. If you have a political party, you have key tensions, and any election contest, usually by its nature, I'm afraid, is quite divisive. And so there was an issue here about how you bring those divisions, how you heal those divisions within the party structure. And to me, I probably underestimated how much time that consumes. I think the second thing that you don't quite realise, although it's a statement of the obvious, the buck stops with you. When I was a minister, I was Minister for Health, Minister for Justice, all these other ministerial positions. If you were really struggling with something, to make a decision, you mulled it over, you thought about it, you were thinking about it constantly. You always had the backstop of the First Minister. You could always knock the First Minister's door and say, look, I'm struggling. What do you think?
Now there is no one to fall back.
There's no backstop. You are the backstop.
Yeah.
You're the person. And that's, and you've got to think, am I making the right or wrong decision? Of course, you make right ones and you make wrong decisions in that. I think the other reality, although I'd been a public figure for a long time, I'd been a cabinet minister for a number of years and government minister for a decade by this point. The level of intrusion into your private family life is to a different level when you become First Minister. And some of that intrusion is well-meaning. People stopping you when you're in the park with your children wanting a photograph. No harm, but it is still an intrusion. Right the way through to threats, harassment. I mean, one of the horrible conversations I had to have with my eldest, my stepdaughter, who was, I think she was only 14 at the time, was about carrying a panic alarm and what to do if you think you're being followed. what to do, how to alert the police, what action to take. Don't take the same 2 routes to school. All these things we had. I mean, that's a horrible conversation to have with one of your children. How to, if there is an intrusion in our home, how to make sure she gets her little sister and we had to get a safe room installed into the house, how you get to the safe room and secure yourself. These are not conversations that normal people, not say normal people, if you're not a politician at a very high level, that you should have to have with your children.
But did you thought of these things before you were sort of, one, coming into politics, but also like when you were, becoming a first minister?
No, not to this level. As I said, I had been in government and had a relatively high profile in Scotland anyway for quite a number of years. This was to a completely different level. So look, I think there's a lot of things that you mull over. Ultimately, I always bring myself back to the point that I'm exceptionally grateful for having the opportunity. An opportunity that so few people have able to have and enjoy in this country, let alone across the world.
Also, like you mentioned about the criticism and threats and harassment, like who are the audience for that? Like who are the people behind it? Obviously, the far right. There was a lot of Muslim community criticism on you for certain things. You were like sort of a sandwich from both sides, from your own side as well as, people who obviously, that they don't like you.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you had the obvious far right, and they have been on my case probably from the day I not just entered politics, but I've been a very vociferous campaigner against hatred, be that Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia, anything. I've stood against hatred my whole life and continue to campaign against it. So you had that, but when you become First Minister, it comes to a different level. People, the hatred intensifies across the world. And then you're right, there was particular, and I've been a strong supporter of minority rights, and I include, for example, the rights of the LGBT community, for example. I'm a believer and have been a believer that if you're a minority like I am, my minority rights can't exist in a vacuum. We need to support the rights of all minorities. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean, for example, that people have to change their religious perspective. I would never suggest that people have to do that. But as a politician and as a political leader, you can't just say, I support the rights of one community, but don't support the rights of another. Now, that often became misinterpreted, deliberately so, I suspect, by some. But I had people with hundreds of thousands of followers, even millions of followers on the internet, doing takfir, saying that, well, this guy can't possibly be a Muslim. And who are you to tell me that I can't be a Muslim? Who are you to question my connection with God? That's not your job. But what you do by saying that is put a target on my back. But look, that again was something I was well aware would happen if I spoke in the way that I did and was forthright in the way that I have been. But ultimately, I think for so many of these people, if they're far right or they're extremists in any other way, shape or form, so many of them are, frankly, keyboard warriors. But it just takes that one person to be unhinged for something to happen. That's my wife would always be saying to me, that you have to take precautions around your own security. Again, that's something you shouldn't have to think about, but I'm afraid is a reality with modern day politics.
Do you still support the LGBTQ?
Look, I still support absolutely the rights of the minority, any minority community, including the LGBT community, to have their rights in this country, in any country.
Because you also mentioned, like, clearly it was a mistake, I think in May 2025 in one of these statements. Yes,
I said the way we handled some legislation around gender self-ID, the way we handled that was a mistake. So look, as I say, I'm a believer that you don't have to change your position, and never suggest that people of faith have to change their faith or what their scripture says. That's their prerogative to believe as they wish to believe. My point has been a very simple one. You cannot support only some minority rights. You either support minority rights or you don't support minority rights.
But do you think, like, people also argue that one is like supporting the minority and one is supporting LGBTQ, and there's a thin line?
I'm not sure I see what the thin line or difference is. So, for example, I took forward the hate crime bill. I was Justice Secretary at the time. And the legislation before I became Justice Secretary, before I brought in the hate crime bill, the legislation as it was protected me as a racial minority from people stirring up hatred against me as a racial minority. My argument in that bill was, if I have that protection against people stirring up hate because of my race, well, why should somebody not have that same protection because of their faith, because of their sexual orientation, or their transgender identity, or their disability? We should. So we can't just pick and choose the rights that we as legislators believe in or don't believe in. Don't get me wrong, as I say, I'm not telling you what you should believe or shouldn't believe or support or not support. But as a legislator, as a government, we've got to make sure that we protect minority rights. And that's something, look, I'll never apologize.
Because when I was researching around this topic, I think a lot of comments which I have seen, especially from British Muslims, or like generally from the Muslim community, was that because you're also saying a lot that your faith is like, center of all of your work. So that's why I think there's a more criticism that, yes, you can say that I don't support LGBTQ, but yes, they should have a rights. Maybe that's the right way to say it, rather than you are saying that the concept of LGBTQ is right.
No, look, again, I'm not necessarily seeing the distinction. I understand what you're saying, but I know, for example, my dear friend Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, he'll often get criticism for example, going to Pride, but he is the representative of all of London. If you're the First Minister of Scotland, you're the representative of the entire nation of Scotland. You're not just the First Minister for the Muslim community or for straight people or for able-bodied people or for one particular race. You're the representative, or actually for one political persuasion. You're the First Minister for everybody. Unionist, independent supporter, straight, gay, black, brown, white, disabled, able-bodied. And you've got to make sure that as First Minister, you're commanding the confidence of all those communities. Well, at the same time, on issues where there is a free vote, so a couple of weeks ago, there was a vote in this parliament on assisting, people often describe it as euthanasia. I was, in that free vote, able to vote and wanted to vote against it for different reasons, but also, of course, there's no doubt that faith considerations come to play a part too. So for me, people will criticise, I think, when you're in that position, whatever you do, whatever you say, as long as you are not just confident, but you are principled in your belief and can articulate that principle, then I think that's what matters.
There's a lot of debate around why did you your resignation. Obviously, there's a lot of internal politics, but again, if we zoom out a little bit, what was the main reason of you going out of the office?
So ultimately, and I reflect a lot on this, as you can imagine, look, I think, truthfully, how I handled the breaking up of the agreement was not the right way to do that. But the actual breaking of the agreement was the right thing to do. But the manner in which it was handled was, I'm afraid, what caused deep anger amongst the Greens, who then decided to vote, for example, with the Conservative motion against my leadership. And ultimately, to boil it down, this is true in Pakistani parliament, it's true in the Scottish parliament, it sometimes just comes down to arithmetic and numbers. And it was clear that the way in which I handled it had lost the confidence of the majority of parliament. I probably could have squeaked a deal through with support from one or two independents, but I think it would have left my party in a weaker position. And I've always said to myself and those that are close to me, if I thought my leadership was damaging my party, the party I've been a member of for over 20 years now, then I would do the right thing and what I think is the honourable thing. And so in my mind, there was no doubt that it was the right thing to do.
And where did you learn about the craft of politics? Like, what were the initial sort of, not really like mentors, but in a way mentors and people who you really look up to, because you have no one in your family as such. So you starting from a scratch and then building it up.
So when you talk about learning the craft of politics, and I will come to that, to me, having reflected a lot about politics, the greatest quality that one can have is empathy. Not political mastery, not an MA in international relations, not a Machiavellian streak that people think most politicians have, but empathy. Because ultimately, being able to empathise with those, particularly who are the most vulnerable, who are the poorest, those who are struggling in our society, makes you a much better politician for it. And I learned that. I don't think you learn that. I think you either have empathy or you don't. But one person that taught me the importance of empathy was actually the first Scottish Pakistani to ever become a member of this parliament, the late Bashir Ahmed, who was a proud Pakistani, although born in India pre-partition in Amritsar. He was a very proud Pakistani who moved post-partition. And he was the kindest and most generous soul that I've come across. And I worked for him for a couple of years. Unfortunately, he died 2 years into his term. But I knew him as a family friend from many years. So he was definitely a huge influence on me. Mother was a huge influence on me because she was always an advocate for social justice. She had had some terrible racism and experienced it over the years and had always stood her ground. Whereas many others in our community used to brush it off. And they would say, look, it's their country. They're the host community. My mother would say, no, I'm living here, contributing here, a citizen here, raising a family here. And she would even challenge it, as she did once in the courts. And she won that legal case against an estate agent who wouldn't show her a home because she was a person of colour. So she was a huge influence. And then I was lucky to have great political mentors as well, former First Ministers, Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond. I worked for both of them. So I was able to learn directly from them, as you say, some of the arts of how this place works in particular.
But do you think with empathy, can you survive in politics? Because a lot of times, like people say, politics is a really bloody, so it's a war. Like you have to whether take a seat or get someone's out from their seat. Like you have to get this done. But when you have empathy, how can you survive in politics?
Well, if your goal is just to simply keep going in politics, if that's your main driver, I want to hold on to political office for as long as possible, then you're not fit to be a leader. Because your motivation should be to serve. We call it public service. And that's why empathy for me is so strong. Don't get me wrong. I'm not being naive. In politics, you're right. There is a lot of political machinations that happen. And I'm sure I've dealt with my own fair share and been involved in some of that myself. But I always try to treat people with respect, treat them well. Yes, I've had to make tough decisions when it's appointing your own government or cabinet and you have to let some people go, or you have to give some hard truths to people in your own team. Then sometimes you just have to do that, but you still try to do it with a level of empathy to give people reason and rationale around why you're doing what you're doing. I think the public are quite smart. I think the public can see through somebody who's simply got naked ambition. So if I give you an example of that, in my view, somebody like Boris Johnson, who just, I think, had nothing but naked ambition, wanted to be Prime Minister for the sake of Prime Minister. They can see that different to somebody who's got public service at their core, at their heart, at their root. And I hope, despite what I've done right and what I've done wrong, lots in between, that people can at least look at me and say, well, look, he did it for the right reasons.
And how was your relationship with the politicians from London and like that part of, that side? You talked about Boris Johnson, and there are a lot of other, and obviously, like as an outsider, you hear a lot of criticism on each other. Then there's a lot of things where you guys collaborate. Like, what is your relationship with the UK Parliament as such?
It was pretty tense. Look, I became First Minister and got a message to my office saying the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, at that time, he wants to speak to you, to congratulate you. And so I thought, okay, look, we're both people from, the subcontinent. From what I can see, he's proud of being that Indian heritage. I'm proud of Pakistani heritage. When we first come on the call, let's try to break the ice. We don't need to go straight into business, break the ice.
But you knew him already? Or
No. I don't think we'd had a conversation before, actually. And so, I said, Rishi, look, we've got two people of colour, people from the subcontinent who are in positions of high office and wanted to congratulate you on what you've achieved. But honestly, he just didn't want any small talk. Straight on to it. He said, okay, and I just want to phone you to congratulate you and look forward to working together. Tried to get off the phone, to which I said, wait, there's a few things I need to raise with you. And he obviously wasn't prepared, so I raised a few things, but had no desire to get involved in the small talk. And that to me said, well, which, you can say, okay, that's his prerogative. He's Prime Minister, he's busy, he's got plenty to get on with. but at the same time spoke to me about somebody who didn't actually care about the relationship between the United Kingdom government and the Scottish government. Just had to tick the box to say, I've sent my congratulations, put out the tweet, done. Whereas it would have been better if we could have established a much deeper relationship, which of course we would still disagree on many issues, but I've had some good relationships with some UK government ministers over the years, and it makes a big difference to the working of your policy and government functions.
And how do you see the Islamophobia? Again, you have talked a lot about it. And in this conversation as well, you talked about how your parents, your mother have seen it, and you have also seen it. And now your daughters. Do you think it changed over the last sort of few decades? Because in this trip, when I talked to a lot of British Pakistanis, they said when we were growing up, there's a lot of hatred from the far right, but now things are getting a little bit better. You mentioned somewhere that maybe Scotland and UK is not the place where I want to raise my kids, and maybe I have to go out. Do you think it's exactly the same?
I think it's got worse for sure. Look, when I was growing up, there was no such word really as Islamophobia. If you were attacked, you were attacked because of your race. They'd be swear words around your race and abuse to do with your race. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and it turned from being a Paki into a terrorist. They switched the lexicon. So they found another reason to hate you, and it was more to do with your faith. And it has been thus, I think, since really 2001, that the majority of hatred I get is Islamophobic, not racial. I get some racial, but mainly Islamophobic. But what's happened in the last number of years, really, across Europe and the West, is this rising tide of the far right. And this far right populism is driven by anti-Muslim hatred. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands openly calls for the banning of mosques and the Quran. The National Front, driven by anti-Muslim hatred in France. The AfD in Germany, the far right party, dedicated an entire chapter of their previous manifesto titled, Islam does not belong to Germany. And then we have in the United Kingdom, the rise of reform, headed by Nigel Farage, who started the general election campaign saying that some British Muslims don't share British values, a dog whistle of the highest order. And of course, after the tragic incident, terrible killings in Southport, where misinformation was deliberately spread, including by the owner of X, the richest man in the world. But that led to bricks being thrown through mosque windows, Muslims being targeted with violence in the street, and a hotel full of asylum seekers almost set ablaze. So I never thought I'd witness such scenes. And I'm afraid if you look at every single opinion poll in the last 6 months, virtually every single one shows Reform increasing their lead and being the most favoured party in the entire United Kingdom. So there's no way, I'm afraid, things are getting better. I'm afraid things are getting much worse.
But why do you think things are getting worse? What's the main reason, do you think? Because again, from an outsider perspective, there's a lot of knowledge. The world is opening up. The digital people want to grow more as a global nation rather than, okay, I'm just British, I'm just Pakistani. So what are some of the reasons you feel like the Islamophobia is increasing a lot in the West overall?
So I would say two predominant reasons. One is the advent of social media. Although knowledge is at our fingertips, so is disinformation and misinformation right at our fingertips. And especially when that is sponsored and spread, as I say, by a man who has a platform that has double the population of the United States, 650 million users on X, for example, thereabouts. You can spread disinformation at the drop of a tweet or a post. So one is the advent of social media means that disinformation spreads far quicker. But actually the underlying root and the cause of the rise of populism, is the rise of populism. Populism has two main pillars. One is to divide society and us versus them. And I'm afraid the them today is Muslims, in the way that the Jews were the target in the 1920s and 1930s. And the second pillar, of course, of populism is to present very simple solutions to very complex problems. So the fact that politicians over many decades have not owned their own political failure, but instead chosen the immigrant, well, that's a much more convenient target instead of saying, look, I've not invested enough in building houses over the last 20 years. The housing stock in the United Kingdom has drastically, the social affordable housing, council housing has reduced drastically since 1979, not because of immigrants, but because they sold off the social housing stock, and didn't replace it with a right to buy. But it's much more convenient to blame Talha, who's got a beard, a funny sounding name, and a different colour of skin. Much easier to blame him for coming to this country and taking your house than it is for me to say, sorry, I didn't quite invest and build the houses that needed to be built. So we've seen that, and I'm afraid this is the age of which Muslims are the target, as I say, much in the way that the Jews and the Jewish community were in the 1920s and 30s.
And what policies do you think whether it's a British Parliament or a Scottish Parliament, need to have to change this perception, like from a government level?
Can I say to you, I don't think it's a policy. There's some policies that can help. So I brought forward the hate crime bill that helps to prevent, I would hope, and act as a deterrent against some hatred. It's not policy, it's political rhetoric and political leadership that's important. So just take immigration as the hot topic. And when a number of people talk about migrants, they talk about a particular type of migrant. Nobody's complaining about Ukrainian refugees coming here because they look like the population, they have the same Judeo-Christian values. And by the way, I support Ukrainian refugees coming here, but that's not the type of immigrant or migrant or refugee that people and political leaders are concerned about, or some political leaders are concerned about. It's the ones that might look like you and I. And the political rhetoric is important. Let me just give you the example between Scotland and England. And by the way, of course, racism exists in Scotland. Islamophobia exists. But I think the situation here is less fraught than it is in some parts of England. For example, we didn't have any riots in Scotland when the Southport riots were taking place in different parts of England. Now, in the Scottish Parliament, where we're sat today, over 25 years old, the consensus has been, political consensus, that immigration has been good for this country. Because our population historically was declining. It's now kind of stabilising, but we need it actually to be moving in the right direction. So our country needs immigration. We have too many job vacancies. We have a working age population that's getting older. So whether the Labour Party has been in power or the SNP has been in power, the political consensus in this Parliament is to be generally pro-migration. Whereas in the last 20, 25 years in the English Parliament, the Westminster Parliament, there has, when immigration is mentioned, I would hazard a guess that 9 times out of 10 is mentioned negatively. It's mentioned as a problem. This is the reason why Brexit happened, is because people were misinformed about migration. It has been the target and the blame for all of the social ills that have taken place. When was the last time a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom stood up and made a speech about how great migration has been for this country? Well, I can't remember. So that then percolates to the population. And my point is, in Scotland, in the most recent social attitude survey, the public viewed migration more positively than they did previously. In England, of course, migration has been perceived more negatively. So I think it's not policy, it's political language, political rhetoric, which is going to make the difference between a society that's entrenched in hate or a society which sees diversity as a strength.
You have talked a lot about Elon Musk as well. And you guys have a bit of, rift over the last year or so. Do you think something has changed? Because now he's in the government as well, working very closely with the Trump. And why do you think X is a main sort of problem in terms of the misinformation, disinformation, and for the support of far right?
Musk is clearly a supporter and sympathizer of the far right and of white supremacy. There's no ifs or buts about it. I mean, the man is literally doing Nazi salutes in our face. He's taunting us. And it was, George Orwell's 1984, that you should reject the evidence of your own eyes. I mean, he is telling you exactly what he is. And when somebody shows you who they are, you should believe them. Again, I think that was from Maya Angelou. So there's no doubt in my mind what Elon Musk is and who he sympathizes with and who he supports. And I am the absolute antithesis of that. I believe in inclusion. I believe in diversity. I believe in a global community. In a global community, there is strength. He doesn't. And I think like any bully, when you challenge them, they don't like it. And when I think rightly said, Elon Musk is the most dangerous man, or one of the most dangerous men on the planet. This was before he came out in declaration of support of Donald Trump. I think everything that he has done since then has only, I'm afraid, proven that statement to be true.
But do you think he's now the most powerful man in the world?
Certainly, I would suggest he's certainly one of the most powerful men in the world. Look, I know his association with Trump, he started to distance himself ever so slightly. And no wonder, because it's not part of a grand plan. It's because Tesla shares have taken a real kicking over the first quarter of Donald Trump's second term. But he has complete unfettered access into the White House. It was reported by the press that he was sitting in interviews for senior jobs in the administration, that he was party to some classified material, which he should never be, have his hands near. And this is an individual who's never been elected in his life, but has such control, influence, and power over arguably the most powerful man in the world. So that's not just dangerous because of what Elon Musk believes in. That's dangerous because it's, I think, a threat to democracy wholesale.
And where do you see the role of social media these days? Because before that, it was whether maybe individuals or political parties, and now like this third dimension, which you own a platform, whether it's Musk, whether it's other players. Do you think this will also change how we do politics in the world in the coming years?
It already has. It already has. I mean, what was Donald Trump's strategy? Strategy was to do as many podcasts as you possibly can, get a huge global reach, huge reach across the United States. Why am I talking to you? Well, I like your program. I've watched it over many years. But look, I probably do, if not more podcasts, probably certainly as many interviews on social media as I'll do with traditional media as well. So I think it's completely changed. I don't think that's all a bad thing. I think this makes politics much more accessible. We're able to get to a younger generation through the likes of TikTok or Instagram in a way that we weren't able to before. But as I say, the flip side is the threat of disinformation too.
If you talk about Gaza, again, you have talked a lot about it. It's been almost 2 years now. Where do we stand right now? And what do you think the world is still not doing what they should be doing?
Gaza, to me, is the most inhumane catastrophe, and of course, man-made catastrophe that I've ever witnessed in my lifetime. It is the moral question of our time. And what makes it so horrifying is not just the scale of death. We can talk about the scale of death, which is tragic, beyond tragic. Talk about the tens of thousands of children killed, women killed, pregnant mothers killed, innocent men killed. But actually, the real tragedy beyond that is that so many have been complicit, and that it's the first live-streamed genocide in the world. It's happening in front of our face. Every time I think I can't see anything more gut-wrenching, then another image pops into my feed. Whether it's a doctor who's lost 9 of her children, or a young girl fighting the flames of a burning building for her own mortality. Every time I think I can't see anything worse, something even more horrifying comes to light. And it's being aided and abetted by the likes of the UK government, who continue to sell arms to Israel. And of course, the United States government, who fund to the tune of billions of dollars the Israeli government, who commit such war crimes and crimes against humanity. So where are we? Look, I've got to continue to hold on to every single small bit of hope I possibly can that maybe the tide is turning and maybe things are going to change. But my goodness, at what cost? What human misery as a result?
Foreign Secretary David Lammy recently condemned the Israeli military action in Gaza and saying it's morally unjustified and suspended the talks. What took the British Parliament like this long to do this? And why do you think the Parliament is doing this now?
Well, I suspect the reason why it's being done now is because they have some cover from the White House. It's been reported that Donald Trump and Netanyahu have maybe had a bit of a rift. There's a distance between them. I thought it was pretty obvious there was a snub when Donald Trump went to the Gulf, but didn't visit an ally they've given billions of dollars to over the last few years. So that might have given diplomatic cover for the likes of the United Kingdom, Canada, France to then speak out in stronger criticism of Israel. But it's a statement that's been made far too late. If it had been made a year earlier, how many thousands of lives potentially could have been saved? But also, let me say that rhetoric is easy. Action is what's required, a meaningful action. So you can't, on the one hand, say, as David Lammy did, the Foreign Secretary, that Israel's actions are, and I quote, an affront to British values, but at the same time sell arms to that government that is committing that affront to British values. You can't do that. So what we need is meaningful action. This week, the UK's envoy to Israel is conducting business meetings, Lord Austin. So on the one hand, you say that Israel's actions are, and I use the Foreign Secretary's words here, monstrous. And on the other hand, you send your envoy to continue trade discussions. I'm afraid the UK government are taking the people for fools, but fools they are not.
Do you think this is also part of the Trump's recent announcement about Jelani, that they are taking the sanctions away? Is it like maybe more of a broader strategy change towards the Middle East?
I hope it is, because Western intervention in the Middle East has been disastrous for the last few decades. I welcome lifting of the sanctions. I think sanctions should be lifted against the Syrian people. Of course, they should continue sanctions against Assad and his regime and those involved in his regime, but not punish the people of Syria. We need Syria in this new dawn to be able to rebuild. And I've been very impressed, I have to say, by the president of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara. And I wish him, but more importantly, the people of Syria, every good luck in rebuilding their country after what has been a horrendous dictatorship that has cost millions of lives.
Just lastly, whenever you go in front of the God, and if the God will ask you, okay, Humza, I have given you a lot of power and authority. What have you done for me and as well as for the Muslim community and generally for the world? What would be your answer?
Well, I hope I can always say that in the Amal Biniyat, that my intention was pure. My intention was clear, and that I was always focused on public service, not on achieving high office, not on achieving status or title. And some of that was bestowed upon me, and I'm grateful for the blessings of God for that. But that I was there to serve the public, and particularly the poorest in our society, to be a voice for those that were the most vulnerable, that were suffering injustice, be that in Glasgow or Gaza.